All right, we're in the helicopter flying handbook. We're in chapter 10, page 5 of 12. In chapter 10, this will be the steep approach. A steep approach is used primarily when there are obstacles in the approach path that are too high to allow a normal approach. A steep approach permits entry into most confined areas and sometimes used to avoid areas of turbulence around a pinnacle. An approach angle of approximately 13 degrees to 15 degrees is considered a steep approach. Caution must be exercised to avoid parameters for settling with power. 20 to 100% of available power applied airspeed of less than 10 knots and a rate of descent greater than 300 feet per minute. For additional information on settling with power, refer to Chapter 11, Helicopter Emergencies and Hazards. All right. Technique. Let's look at the picture. Technique. On final approach, maintain track with the intended touchdown point and into the wind as much as possible at the recommended approach airspeed. Position 1. When intercepting an approach angle of 13 to 15 degrees, begin the approach by lowering the collective sufficiently to start the helicopter descending down an approach path and decelerating. Position 2. Use the proper anti-torque pedal for the trim. Since the angle is steeper than a normal approach angle, reduce the collective more than the required for a normal approach. Continue to decelerate with a slight aft cyclic and smoothly lower the collective to maintain the approach angle. The intended touchdown point may not always be visible throughout the approach, especially when landing to a hover. Pilots must learn to cue into other references that are parallel to the intended landing area that will help them maintain ground track position. Constant management of the approach angle and airspeed is essential to any approach. Aft cyclic is required to decelerate sooner than a normal approach, and the rate of closure becomes apparent to a high altitude. Maintain the approach angle and rate of descent and with the collective rate of closure with the cyclic and trim with anti-torque pedals. The helicopter should be kept in trim prior to loss of the effective transitional lift, approximately 25 knots below 100-foot AGL. The anti-torque pedal should be adjusted to align the helicopter with the intended touchdown point. Visualize the location of the tail rotor behind the helicopters and fly the landing gear to 3 feet above the intended landing point in small confined areas. The pilot must precisely position the helicopter over the intended landing area. Therefore, the approach must stop at that point. Loss of effective transitional lift occurs in a steep approach, position number 3, requiring an increase in collective to prevent settling and more forward cyclic to achieve the proper rate of closure. Once the intended landing area is reached, terminate the approach to a hover with 0 ground speed, position number 4. If the approach has been executed properly, the helicopter will come to a halt at the hover altitude of 3 feet over the intended landing point, where very little additional power required to hold the hover. The pilot must aware that any wind effect is lost once the aircraft has descended below the barriers surrounding the confined area, causing the aircraft to settle more quickly. Additional power may be needed on a strong wind condition as a helicopter descends below the barriers. Common errors of the steep approach. Failing to maintain proper RPM during the entire approach. Using collective improperly in maintaining the selective angle of descent. Failing to make anti-torque pedal corrections to compensate for collective pitch changes during the approach. Slowing airspeed excessively in order to remain on the proper angle of descent. Failing to determine when effective transitional lift is being lost. Failing to arrive at hovering altitude and attitude and 0 ground speed almost simultaneously. Utilizing low RPM and transition to the hover at the end of the approach. Using too much aft cyclic close to the surface, which may result in the tail rotor striking the surface. Failure to align landing gear with direction of travel no later than the beginning of loss of transitional lift. All right, so we'll hold off there. That is chapter 10, page 5 and 6. That is your steep approach in the Helicopter Flying Handbook, chapter 10. See ya.